Good morning, everyone. So we're actually going to get right into it because we're going to try to keep today a little bit shorter because I'm actually in transit of locations right now. So we're going to get right into it to begin. And usually what we have every week is Thunder Sharma, who actually opens up for us. Unfortunately, Thunder is taking a day off and won't be able to join us today. So I will be opening it up and just talking a little bit about my own work, and then also a little bit about my reflections on today's workshop and how we're going to kind of ground ourselves in the conversations that we need to have. Especially because today we're going to be talking about fertility awareness for all bodies. And I currently am on the territory of the Mi'kmaq. I'm in Quebec right now, in Gaspé, and I originally hail from Toronto, so a whole different community of people. And a lot of what I've been thinking about recently around bodies and how I understand our connection to the land is that it is very severed. And I think what capitalism and colonization has done is that it has really taken us away from our own practices, our own traditions and values around how we understand our connection to the body, and also birth making and creating life, creating these connections that we do. And so for me, especially as someone from Caribbean descent and also from East African descent, and also have been colonized through different ways, I'm thinking about how I can also contribute to thinking about my connection to the land and bringing babies onto this land. And that's really important for me, especially because I have a daughter. And my responsibilities as a settler here, and as a settler, particularly in Toronto, is very big for me right now, and has always been. And I think it's an opportunity for us to think about how we are also responsible to the land, and also the people here, the caretakers of this land, and the people who originally and have been consistently fighting for the land and water that we all enjoy and live off of. And so, yeah, so I wanted to just share some gratitude with that for that. And then also thinking about particularly around fertility and the process of getting to know our bodies and thinking about how our connections can be really fraught with our bodies. And, for myself as a fat person, also the ways that the medical industrial complex really doesn't support our bodies of knowing ourselves, and that we actually rely on experts to know what's happening in our own bodies. So this is an opportunity for us to really think about, what our relationship is to ourselves and our physical vessel. And then also thinking about what support we need from ourselves, and then also from our community around how to really think about a more holistic way of understanding fertility and understanding our connection to those particular areas of our body that need that care and support. And what we're going to kind of discover today in terms of talking about fertility is how fertility work is actually very much connected to a full bodily response. I had a practitioner once tell me that the reproductive system actually is the last system that your body will actually support. Sorry, are you having trouble hearing me? No? Okay, perfect. So a practitioner actually told me once that your body is actually taking care of all other systems, and then the reproductive system is the last one, right? But it is connected still to, like, your heart, it's connected to your digestive system. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few weeks. If you were with us last week, we talked about the different ways that you can go through a fertility process. And so that kind of gave us the overview of what the different ways are that things come together with the egg, sperm, and a place to grow. And so that's kind of was our 101 on that. And that will bring us to now today, where we're going to start talking about fertility. So we're going to get right into it. If you have any questions, please leave them to the end. I'm not going to be looking at the chat until the very end. So please feel free to write them down in the chat, and then I will get to them after, or you can come on the mic and we can go from there. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we'll get started. Okay. So fertility awareness for everyone. That's my email. If anybody wants to get in touch with me afterwards, you're more than welcome to as well. And Gab, I don't know if you wanted to touch on this. This is kind of just an overview of birthmark in particular. Gab is our amazing human that does all this work at Birthmark and is also the programming person for Seed and Sprout. I don't know if you wanted to, or if you wanted me to just read over.
Hi, folks. Yeah, sure, Aruna, I'll jump in here. My name's Gab. My pronouns are they and them. I'm the Seed and Sprout Program Coordinator here at Birthmark Support. Birthmark is a charity that provides the services that you see here on the screen. So birth and postpartum and abortion doula services in the Toronto and Hamilton area. We have a donation center where folks can get like all the things that you need for like the first year and even then some of baby's life, not strollers and stuff because of silly laws, but anyways, and also other classes and workshops and offerings like this one here, providing information and education for families within the Seed and Sprout community. We make the intention of prioritizing queer and trans families. And yeah, if you have any questions about those services or supports, feel free to message me in the chat or reach out to me via email. I'll drop my email in the chat as well. Thanks, Aruna.
Great, thank you. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about cycles, hormones, our bodies, stages of the cycle. So that's the four cycles is the menstrual cycle, then the follicular, ovulation, and luteal. And then we'll be talking specifically about cycle monitoring and what that looks like, both in the clinic setting for IUIs and IVF. And then we'll also be then talking about fertility awareness and an overview. So just to begin, of course, as I've said last time and before, that this is not medical, legal, or clinical advice. This is specifically just information. All of this information can be found online and cannot be considered more than an educational forum or for information. If you're starting your reproductive or fertility journey, please consult your family physician, specialist, or fertility clinic for information that is specific to you. So remember, this is very general information. This information is particular to Ontario as well in Canada. So we had some folks from the States. There's a few Ontarios all over the place. So it's specific to Canada, Ontario. Laws, medical support, access to 2S LGBTQ plus services are specific and they might not be available where you're located. So please check locally. And so please check out local supports and information specific to your province or a country. Okay. So we're going to get right into it. I'm just looking for my notes here. There we go. Okay. So overview of what we'll be looking at. So today we're actually literally going to be talking about our cycles and what that actually looks like. And this specifically, of course, is for folks who have ovaries, who are looking at their fertility journey from that point of view, or are looking at or are interested in knowing what things that they need to think about in terms of working with someone, whether or not you have sperm or you have ovaries or eggs, uterus or eggs, to think about where you are in the cycle and what needs to happen. Okay, so depending on where you are or who you are in the journey of making a baby, we can talk about what specific things you need to know. So we're going to be looking at a quote unquote 28-day cycle for your fertility journey and what that looks like in that. We'll be looking specifically at the uterine cycle, ovarian cycle, and these are the different hormones here that we'll be talking about. Okay, and we're going to get right into what the hormones actually are. So if you look at where we start, we're going to be looking actually at the endocrine gland, which is actually in your head. It's in your brain. It's in the pituitary gland in your brain. And so that actually is where we get FSH. And FSH is a follicle stimulating hormone. That is, that's what actually starts this whole process. So it stimulates follicular growth in your ovaries, which then stimulates the estrogen secretion, and then from that actually develop the follicles. What also comes from the pituitary gland is the LH. So that's the luteinizing hormone, which is kind of like, well, we're going to talk about this surge that happens that causes the ovulation to happen. So if we're looking at a cycle, it goes up, 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 and then all of a sudden a really big peak, and that's the ovulation spike, and then it goes back down. And so I'll show you that in a second. And that's what results in what actually is the formation of the corpus luteum, which is actually the egg, the follicle actually breaks down, and then the egg is there, and that's what happens. That's caused by the luteinizing hormone. And then so what happens in the ovaries is that estrogen is produced. And I'm sure many folks have heard of estrogen and progesterone in particular. Estrogen is actually what creates the endometrium, which thickens the lining of the uterus. And that's where the egg actually implants itself. So what we want for a successful pregnancy is we actually want a really thick uterine lining, which is actually a really good sign that the egg will actually be able to attach on and then create the fetus, right? And so what estrogen also does is it inhibits FSH and the LH for most of the cycle, but it also stimulates it. So it does actually both. It's actually this really amazing hormone that actually inhibits it, but then also stimulates it before ovulation. And then for the rest of the cycle, it's lower. Progesterone has a very small but very meaningful role, which actually thickens the uterine lining as well, and then also inhibits the FSH and LH. It's at the end of the cycle. So we'll actually, when we see the lines, if we go back to our original thing here, FSH is here, the blue one, and then it goes down, and then it goes up, and then it's down again. Progesterone actually does not spike until after the ovulation in the middle happens. And the estrogen actually is also high, and then low, and then it goes up again, and then down again, depending on what happens. And then we'll see, and we see here too, the uterine cycle. The lining is thick, and then you have your menses or your menstrual cycle, and then the lining's gone. And then during ovulation, that's when it gets thick again, and then it secretes afterwards. And so we'll talk about these more in detail. And so there's also something called the I can't ever say this word properly, gonadotropin releasing hormone, so GnRH. So before we get to ovulation, and before we get to a follicular stimulation, or before the follicles are created, we actually get a signal from the the area of our brain, which is actually the release. It's known as that releasing hormone. And so they're mainly participating in the menstrual cycle and reproduction, and it actually stimulates the FSH and LH secretion from the pituitary gland. And the FSH, which is what we're talking about here, at the very start of it, is actually what's measured by clinics. So when you go in for your day, as we talked about last week, you're actually going to go in for cycle monitoring on your day 3 of your cycle. And what they're measuring is the amount of FSH hormone in your pituitary, so in your body. And that's kind of known as the gas pedal of the cycle. So as the FSH goes up, the pituitary gland is actually trying to get more response from the ovaries. It's what actually tells the ovaries to produce more follicles. As there are fewer eggs, the pituitary makes more FSH day 3, and then the FSH, if it's a high number, then you might not need as many, for example, stimulating medications in an IVF or an IUI cycle. Estrogen, as I said, is produced by ovaries. It's monitored through the blood work throughout the follicular stage, so through the follicle stage. And what actually happens also, and we'll talk about this after as well, is the cervical mucus, the mucus that is secreted, it actually increases right before ovulation. So it actually maintains the lining of the uterus. And so for progesterone, which is the one at the end, so we have ovulation, and then it dips. It's produced by the ovaries, and it gradually decreases until menstruation. So it also helps the lining of the uterus, and you need that for a strong pregnancy as well. Other things that will come up and that we'll talk about is HCG. So HCG is the human chorionic, I can't say that word again, gonadotropin. HCG is actually made by cells formed in the placenta, which actually nourishes the embryo after it's implanted in the lining of the uterine wall, so the endometrium. So that thickening of the uterus, when there is a pregnancy there, or when there is an implantation there, that's what is actually, when you take a pregnancy test, that's actually what they're actually detecting. So HCG levels can be first detected by a blood test about 11 to 12 days after conception. So after that egg actually is implanted into the uterine lining, and about 12 to 14 days after conception. So the numbers will get higher and higher. That HCG level will actually get higher and higher and higher if you're pregnant. And when we talk about conception, just something to also consider when we're talking about IVF, when we're talking about conception, we're talking about the moment of conception is actually about 6 days after the transfer of a 5-day embryo. So remember what we talked about last time is for IVF, you're actually taking out the egg, you're putting the sperm with the egg together, you're creating an embryo. Then you leave that embryo for 5 to 6 days to see if it gets bigger. And then that's when we're talking about conception. So you will have some days off if you're doing IVF because of the ways that the days were decided based on how many days it took for the embryo to grow. So just so we're all clear about what we're talking about in terms of body parts, we're talking about the fallopian tubes are here, the ovaries are on both sides, and the uterus, which is where that endometrium that we were talking about, is actually in the middle. So that's where this actually grows and the baby will grow in there. Okay. So those are the main parts that we need to know. And all right. So when you're charting and mapping your cycle, it's actually about knowing your patterns. So you're usually trying to chart or monitor for about 2 to 3 cycles. And when we say chart or monitor, we're going to get into what that means in a second. But you usually want to do for 2 to 3 cycles. And the reason for that is because it does shift. Things like stress, things like other kinds of things can really impact your cycle, and everyone is different. And to be aware of the changes is actually really important, because what it means is that it allows for you to actually see what kinds of things would actually be useful for or noticing those differences, right? So that's really important for you to consider around what you're actually going to like, what is it looking like from 2 to 3 different cycles. So I would say if you're planning to get pregnant, for example, what I did for myself was I actually gave myself 3 months before I actually even tried. What I did with that, and as I charted, I did cycle monitoring with my IVF clinic, but I also did all my supplements. I started taking prenatals about 3 to 4 months before, and that really allows for your egg quality to also be at its prime, right? I didn't have control over the quality of the sperm that I had because I got a frozen sperm donor. So that was already donated like years and years before. So what I wanted to do and what I had the ability to do was to really, really amp up my egg quality. And I think that's a really important thing to consider, is if you're not taking prenatals, if you're not taking supplements, those are some things that if you're thinking about starting a pregnancy or getting pregnant, those are some things to consider getting into now. You chart to know your fertility, your pregnancy potential, or people also chart to know when to have sex without potentially getting pregnant. So there's different ways and reasons why people chart or map their cycle. There are 4 phases in your cycle. There's the menstruation cycle, there's the follicular phase, there's ovulation, and then there's the luteal phase, which either leads to fertilization and implantation or then the menstrual cycle. Okay. So the first one we're going to talk about is menstruation. So your cycle actually begins on the first day that you have red blood bleeding. If you're going to a fertility clinic for either an IUI or an IVF cycle, then this is when you would go in for a day 1 or a day 3 cycle monitoring, ultrasound and blood work. So they're going to both do an intravaginal, they're going to look at your number of eggs and your follicles in your ovaries. And then they're also going to do blood work to look at the hormones that we were talking about earlier. So the FSH and then how much estrogen you have in your body. So your cycle should last between 5 to 8 days. And of course, as we know, people's bodies are very different and everyone's cycle is very different. Also, if you have PCOS or if you have other things going on, endometriosis, that will also impact how your cycles look. And so thinking about your own situation and your own cycles, you have to really consider what that's going to look like for what it looks like for you to cycle monitor, right? So that's why thinking about how you're going to do this over time, to really think about how you're going to map out when you're ovulating, because looking for those signs of ovulation is going to help you in implantation and and getting that egg meeting the sperm. So the second phase is the follicular stage. And so this is a little complicated. So I hope everyone's with me so far. And if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat so that I could take a look at them. So we're going to remember, we're talking about the hormones. We're talking about the FSH, which is right here. And then we're going to be talking about the estrogen, which also should be high, getting higher. Estrogen gets higher. And then see the progesterone is very, very low. So LH should also be low. So the luteinizing hormone, which is the orange one, should also be low up until that moment right before ovulation. Ovulation ideally happens in a quote unquote normal, I say that very, 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 very lightly, normal cycle is around the 14th or halfway point between a 28-day cycle. So if your cycles are 30 days, 34 days, 35 days, 40 days even, you're looking at the middle point. The reason for that is because you're looking for the moment of ovulation. That's when you're going to want to do the insemination. That's when you're going to want to do, that's when cycle monitoring, if you're doing through IVF or IUI, or if you're doing at home, that's when you're looking for that sweet spot, right? Right before, it's usually like 2 days before you're ovulating and 2 days after are when you're the most ready for the sperm to access the egg. And so you're looking at these hormones, right? So your FSH should be low, estrogen is getting higher. And then you're looking for that spike. And that spike in the luteinizing hormone is where the follicle actually becomes the egg. And then the ovulation happens. If there's nothing that happens in terms of if that doesn't happen, if there's no sperm that attaches to the egg, then it just goes into another menstrual cycle, and the progesterone gets high. And then if there's no egg attached to the endometrium, then what happens is then it just goes lower. Okay. So for testing day, as I said, there's the day 3, and then there's the day 8, which is HSG, which is another hormonal test that you can take for in a clinic setting. So what's happening in your body is essentially that your eggs are developing, they get released, the lining starts building, cervical fluid also starts increasing right before ovulation. And then the FSH, that follicle stimulating hormone, actually triggers the egg ripening and estrogen production. So again, that's all happening from the pituitary glands. And as the estrogen gets higher, it actually suppresses that FSH hormone and stimulates instead the LH, which is the luteinizing hormone, and then closer to ovulation. So what you're looking for at ovulation, which is that peak that we're looking for, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit also in the next one, is that your cervix could be softer. So I'm not sure if anyone has ever checked their own cervix, but cervixes actually change throughout a cycle. And so as you're getting closer to right before ovulation, your cervix literally becomes softer. And you can, if you have an opportunity to check out your cervix, you can definitely do that. You'll actually notice it becomes softer. It also starts rising, so it gets higher. The cervical mucus, it becomes wet and stringy. And I have a picture that I can show you later to get an idea of that. And for cycle monitoring, you're doing the blood work and ultrasound. And many follicles should be there. Usually 1 or 2 happen in a non-medicated cycle. So if you're not taking medication to amp up the amount of follicles, which you would do in IVF or IUI sometimes, you'll have usually 1 or 2 main dominant follicles. You may have a bunch of follicles that start, but the ones that keep growing, there'll be 1 or 2 at least. Yeah, okay, great. So then we're getting into the follicular cycle, which is the second one. In the follicular cycle, estrogen levels, they rise, as we talked about, which actually creates the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus. The length of your follicular stage actually depends and can change based on the person. So people who have irregular cycles or cycles that are longer will find that their follicular phase is longer in long cycles and shorter cycles. Okay, so this is when the egg starts to develop. one or two usually eggs at max, if you're not doing medication, will start to release, and then the endometrium will shed its lining and begin to rebuild if there's no implantation. Cervical fluid is also produced before ovulation, as I said, and that is very important to know your own cycle and to know if this is something that's you're close to, if you're close to ovulation. And let me see what else. Yeah. And so there are different hormones that I talked about. And then also signs that you're getting closer to ovulation. When I was talking about the cervical mucus, I'm not sure if anyone has ever tried or checked their cervical mucus, but this is an opportunity, maybe if you're looking at your own cycle monitoring, to start getting familiar with the different kinds of cervical mucus you have. So that's that stuff that comes out of the actual vagina. And so what that happens is that cervical mucus changes depending on where you are in the cycle. So cervical mucus can be either egg white, sometimes it's very thick. If it's very thick, then it usually is not close to ovulation. It actually will become clear and stretchy. And I'll show you a picture of what to look for. There may also be ovulation cramping. Some folks actually feel when their body is releasing the egg. And that's the intuition that I was talking about earlier around the difficulties that we have around being connected to our bodies and the ways that capitalism and colonization have really taken us outside of being in tune with what's happening. Some folks are able to actually feel that egg releasing from their ovaries. And so it is actually just a matter of like noticing different things that you're feeling in your body and identifying it and being mindful about that is really helpful and can be really hard. So yeah, and then the big moment happens, which we're all waiting for. This is the big, like, yes, this is it, is the ovulation time. Okay, so the dominant follicles at this point that we were talking about, so here, the FSH and estrogen are going up. They're creating the ovulation time. And so if you look at these little follicles, the follicular stage is the days 1 to 3. And it leads us to this middle part where we're ovulating. So what that means is that the follicle actually sheds that lining that it's in and the egg is there. It's called corpus luteum. And so this is the moment where we're the most quote unquote fertile. Okay, so the dominant follicles reach the maximum size that it can, they burst, and then the ovum is released towards the fallopian tubes, and then they go towards the uterus. So that's when the LH, which is the luteinizing hormone, that's when it spikes. Once that spike is over, it dips very quickly, right? So as soon as that, it goes right down. Estrogen also spikes and then definitely goes down. But the thing that goes up is the progesterone. Okay. So the signs that you are ovulating is cervix is high, open, and soft. So it kind of feels like your lips. If you touch your lips, that's usually what your cervix should feel like. The cervical mucus that you're going to feel is also, it's, as I said, it's not thick. It's very thin and stretchy. And so sometimes what folks also use in order to do fertility awareness for themselves is actually an ovulation predictor kit, an OPK kit. And that actually can be really useful because what it does is it actually will tell you where you're actually at the moment that you're ovulating. So that's also another tool that you can use. That then takes us to the luteal phase. So the luteal phase is right after ovulation. It's kind of like this big crash that happens in your body. You have all these hormones up, and then it comes down, except for the progesterone, right? In the follicular development, this is where the egg goes, and then it dissipates. And that's where it becomes then your menstrual cycle again. Or if it's implanted, which is what we want for fertility or for pregnancy, that's when it would attach to the endometrium, okay? So an empty follicle turns into a corpus luteum, which then produces the progesterone, and uterine lining starts to prepare for the embryo. So that's where the embryo is getting implanted into the lining. The length of the luteal phase again varies from person to person and can be anywhere between 10 and 14 days. So that's the other half of that cycle after ovulation. And if the egg meets the sperm, which is what we want, the fertilization may occur during the luteal phase. This is where, if it worked, this is where it's going to happen. Fertilization is when the egg and sperm combine and form an embryo. If the egg did not meet the sperm, or the egg and sperm do not combine, so sometimes they meet each other, but it doesn't actually, they're not able to stay together, they're not able to combine, then there will be no embryo. And if they do form an embryo, it will implant in the lining of the uterus and continue to develop. When implantation is successful, the embryo secretes a hormone, which is called HCG, which is what we were talking about earlier. That's what sends a signal to your body, to the corpus luteum on your ovaries, to keep producing the progesterone to support the pregnancy to continue. So our body actually just like signals to each other what it needs in order to keep this pregnancy going, if it is a viable pregnancy. If your body does not get a hormone signal from the developing or embryo, so if the embryo and the corpus luteum does not kind of send that signal, then the corpus luteum stops producing the progesterone. So see where the red goes down here, it stopped it, right? So progesterone, this cycle, this example of a cycle means that there was not an embryo created. When the progesterone levels drop, your uterus will then expel or start menstruating the uterine lining, and menstruation begins. And then the cycle starts all over again. So then we're right back to the very, very beginning. So the luteal cycle is the same usually from cycle to cycle. If you have a luteal cycle that is less than 10 days, so if you notice that you're ovulating and then all of a sudden you're getting your period very quickly right afterwards, that actually is a sign that you should probably speak to your doctor. Some signs of the luteal phase is that the temperature rises with progesterone at ovulation, and then it remains a little bit high, and then it drops very slowly. When progesterone drops, your temperature also drops. So, and I'll talk a little bit about doing your basal body temperature or temperature monitoring and what that will look like. All right, so just an overview of the menstrual cycle. I really like this slide, actually. So this is something that I really like to share with folks. This is just an overview here. So again, we're going to start at the very start of this. We're starting on day 1 of our menstrual cycle. That then takes us to the follicular stage, which is where the FSH and the estrogen is creating up to this moment of developing a follicle. And then the LH actually kickstarts the ovulation. And the ovulation, then what happens is then the egg comes out of the follicle. The corpus luteum, which is what the follicle leaves behind, if there is an implantation that happens, progesterone then shoots up from the corpus luteum, and then it either becomes menses, or in our case, what we want to see happen is it actually becomes an embryo that gets implanted in a very thick endometrium or endometrium lining. Okay, so that's what we're hoping, that the endometrium lining here, a uterine cycle, actually develops thickness so that the progesterone levels can go up, and then we get a successful pregnancy. Okay. So the big question, how do we actually track and monitor our cycle? So remember that timing is everything. As you've seen so far with our cycles, it is about looking at timing, noticing signals, noticing what's happening for us individually. A human egg is able to fertilize for about 24 hours. That egg, that corpus luteum, that thing that comes out of ovulation, it literally, that when that peak happens, you have about 24 hours, and you typically only ovulate once per cycle. So even if you release 2 eggs in one cycle, the ovulations will occur very close together. There won't be 1 day and then 4 days later. It's all going to be, because of that hormone that it needs, they're going to be pushed out at the same time usually. And that's when even if you have 2 eggs, you're going to be able to potentially, hopefully fertilize one of them. Sorry, I just saw, oh, okay. I was just gabbing in the chat. Okay. So fresh sperm, so we talked about this last week. So if you have fresh sperm can actually live in that whole cycle, that whole system, which is the canal that it goes up, and then live in the uterus for up to 5 days after either sex or insemination. So fresh sperm, that has not been frozen. Frozen sperm, on the other hand, are only able to fertilize the egg within 24 hours of insemination. Once it is put up there, then it only can survive, like literally will die within 24 hours. If you are trying to conceive with frozen sperm, timing is incredibly important. And that is why if you're using frozen sperm, you want to think maybe about either doing a lot amount of either with clinic monitoring and tracking, cycle monitoring, or you want to be very, very precise about your own. And the reason for that is because frozen sperm is very expensive, right? So one vial usually, as we talked about last week, is going upwards of $750 per vial if you're doing frozen sperm. And then, or unless it's a known donor who gave it. So unknown frozen sperm is what I'm talking about. And then, so every try that you have is one try, but every cycle, sometimes what people do is at the peak of ovulation or the peak of that luteinizing hormone, they will inseminate frozen sperm and then they'll do it again the next day. And the reason why for that is that if you just, it's a very, very specific and careful dance that you have to have. And you have to be very careful of making sure that you actually get it in time for the egg to meet the sperm, right? So it's actually a miracle that anyone is even born because this timing is so specific. So the best timing for insemination is before ovulation occurs. So with fertility awareness, you are trying to actually predict when you will ovulate. Once you have ovulated, it's generally too late. It's too late if you've already ovulated and it's done. You'll have to wait till your next cycle. Cycle monitoring is when a fertility clinic is monitoring you through blood work and ultrasound, as we talked about. On your day 3, it starts, and they continue throughout your cycle to track your fertility and pinpoint when you ovulate. You may wish to use fertility awareness in combination with cycle monitoring. So you could do your at-home fertility awareness in addition to the in-clinic cycle monitoring. Some people really find it empowering to understand their cycle through a combination of the both. If you're taking fertility medication for either IUI or at home or for IVF in particular, they actually may change some of your awareness signs. So it might change the thickness of your cervical mucus. It might change how your cervix feels. So you may not be able to do fertility awareness as accurately. So you should probably talk to your fertility clinician or specialist in terms of what things will actually change for cycle monitoring. I've noticed that at fertility clinics, they also, when you tell them that you're doing at-home cycle monitoring or fertility awareness, they kind of laugh about it. So, and that's just because, they want to believe in their process only. And so, it's important for you, if you want to know, if you really want to know and track your own stuff in addition to their cycle monitoring, it is also okay to do. And it also, the more the better, so don't feel like you don't have to, or you shouldn't because they don't want you to. So if you are going to a clinic for IUIs, this is the process here. So for IUI, as we talked about last week, your fertility tracking can be done through a clinic. In order to go through a clinic and get that done with an IUI, you actually have to go to a family physician and get referred to a fertility clinic. You can also do IUIs at home via ReproMed, and you can still choose to do cycle monitoring via clinic if you want to track at home. So you call in on your day 1, you then get a day 3 ultrasound to find out how many follicles you have going on and how many are being produced in that cycle. And remember, every cycle is different. So one cycle, for example, I had like 5 follicles being made. The next month that I did cycle monitoring, I had 12, right? So it really depends. Every cycle is different. And sometimes what they'll do is if you have a really high number in one cycle and then you have a low one and then you have another high one again, they're actually going to be like, we don't want to risk not doing this now. So they might say, you know what, let's actually, if you want to get pregnant, let's do this cycle. So that's why I'm saying it is very important to track and do cycle monitoring and fertility awareness over a span of a few months, as opposed to just going in once. So they're going to find out how many follicles you have, what your estrogen and your FSH is. And then depending on your cycle, you actually go in and you start doing blood test ultrasound to measure the follicles. So they're going to keep actually doing this until they realize what your ovulation is, when you're reaching ovulation, and also how big and how many follicles you're actually making. So remember, you're probably releasing only 1 or 2 if you're not doing medication. But they want to see how big these are getting. And they're actually going to measure them. They're actually going to measure how big your follicles are in every cycle. So that's important to remember as well. Other tests that also could happen could be a sonogram, which is actually a histogram, sorry, which is actually when they push dye up into your reproductive system to clear out and to see if there's any kind of blockages happening in fallopian tubes and things like that. Often people have said that the sun histogram actually is really helpful with fertility because it actually will clear out things that were there before. So they actually put a dye in and it actually pushes everything around. AMH is also something, it's another hormone level test that they can actually see how much of that hormone is left in your body. We actually have a significant amount when we're younger, and as we get older, the AMH levels get lower. And so if you have a low AMH number, they're actually going to really push for you to either do maybe IVF or do more assisted reproductive support, because your numbers are lower and it's actually might be harder for you to get pregnant. The AMH level is important because it actually is what signals your brain to actually create the follicles, right? So you want to really have a high AMH, or if you don't have a high AMH, to get the support you need either medically or to see if you can amp it up with the other supplements or things like that. All right, so the next one, I'm not going to talk about this in too much detail because everyone is different depending on what kind of IVF cycle you're doing, but essentially it is pretty much the same thing as IUI, except you're also going to be monitored throughout the medication you're taking for IVF. And again, it really depends on whether or not you're also going to be doing the implantation or the transfers of the embryos once they're created. If that is the case, if you're doing that right in the same cycle, everything will happen in the same cycle and it is based on your ovulation. So you do the same thing. You go in for day 3 sonogram and information. You get the ultrasound and blood work. Once they determine where you are in the cycle, the next step will be then figuring out medication. And then based on your medication, right before you hit ovulation, they will then extract all of your eggs through a mini surgery. And then once they've done that, then they will actually make the embryos in the petri dish. That's why it's in vitro. And then they will ask you, do you want to put them back in now and do a transfer, like a fresh transfer? That's what it's called. Or do you want to freeze them and then do it the month later? Some people, want to do a fresh transfer because they don't want to do the freezing part, and we still don't know really how it impacts the eggs or the embryos. And so some people will go straight for a fresh embryo transfer. If that is the case, then you will do that right after ovulation. So they have to be very careful about timing. And then they'll actually give you more drugs to help. It'll be estrogen, it'll be progesterone in particular that you'll keep taking. I actually took progesterone through the entirety of my pregnancy because I needed to make sure that I kept my baby in, and that's a whole other story. But that was a really important part for me to actually make sure that she had the lining was still thick and the uterus was still ample for her to stay in. And so then we're going into if you're going to do it at home. So if you don't want to go to a clinic to do the blood tests and the ultrasounds, that's totally fine. It's also really important for you to know that, right? So if you are not okay with ultrasounds, if you're not okay with blood work, if medical spaces are also something that's not safe for you or feeling safe for you, you can also do this at home. And so what that means is that you're actually tracking this yourself. So this also requires a lot of attunement into your body and into what's happening for your body at various points of your cycle. So I don't know if you can see the details in this. This is actually a sample from, it's called Maya Fertility, which is a midwifery clinic in California. They do really great resource work for fertility tracking and monitoring. And so just some things that we can talk about from now, and we're going to talk about fertility awareness in the next one as well. This is just kind of a chart, which is a good example. And we have some, there are resources online. If you want to have your own fertility tracking chart, you can actually figure that out. You can actually just get this online. Just Google home fertility cycle tracking. If you want to go on the Maya website, it's MAIA. Just Google Maya fertility tracking, and that should, the actual example of this that you can fill in yourself will actually come up. They actually did a new one recently, and it's actually a really good tool to have if you're going to consider doing home cycle tracking. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is bleeding. So you're actually going to track the first day of your bleeding. How many days are your period? What kind of cycle do you have? Is it light? Is it heavy? Those are all really important. People also track the phases of the moon. So the moon is actually very directly related to our cycles. And so that is something that also people chart. You can also chart insemination. So the day that you inseminate, and then also that point is really important. Pain, any kind of ovulation pressure, sensations that are happening in your body or in that area. That's important for you to start thinking about how ovulation and what it looks like. Cervical changes. So as I was saying, your cervix actually changes depending on where you are. So where you are in your cycle. It can be either high or low, depending on where you are in the cycle. It can be open or closed, soft, firm. Colors can change as well. Mucus color and consistency also changes. So when you're dry, when you don't have a lot of cervical mucus, that's usually when you're not ovulating. What your body actually does is it actually is creating the conditions for sperm to enter into the cervix easily. So that's why it becomes more wet. It becomes more slippery, stretchy, thin, sticky and wet. If the mucus itself becomes clearer. So if you, and I'm going to show you on the next slide, actually, the actual cervical mucus, actually, like when you pull it apart, you can actually like, it either breaks or it's really stretchy. That's a really good moment for ovulation, right? Pre-ovulation. Other people also look at something called ferning, which is actually, they put the cervical mucus on it's actually really sciencey and I really love it. They put it on a microscope and you can actually tell. So the cervical mucus, if you put that on a microscope, it looks like ferns, and it looks like a fern that you would have in your like a house plant or a plant outside. It looks like it's actually ferning. And that's when the more ferning that is happening, the closer you are to ovulation. It's kind of beautiful if you think about it. The other really cool tidbit about that is that ferning, if you actually take the saliva on your tongue and you also put it on a microscope when you're ovulating, it will also look like ferning. So it's just a really cool thing that I thought was really cool. Of course, people use the regular, you can get these at Shoppers or at a pharmacy. You can use an ovulation kit or predictor. So those are also another thing that's really useful that people use to chart out and map out when they're closest to ovulation. And then lastly, and this is, you'll hear about this as you're charting through yourself and charting through things, is the basal body temperature monitoring. And so what that is that actually is, it's a particular kind of, it's not just a regular temperature. It's not a regular like thermostat, or what is it called? I don't know the English word, sorry. It's not like a regular one that you use to determine temperature. It literally has to be the basal body temperature one. And you can buy this at Shoppers for like $10. And it is a monitor to monitor your temperature the moment you wake up. And so the way that I was told and explained about this, as you get closer to your point of ovulation, and as we can see actually on there, is if we look at their temperature here. So their temperature goes up and down, of course. It actually goes really down though. And if we look at this closer to where we are in their cycle, it actually lines up. Their moment of ovulation is right here. Right? So this is the phase of the moon here. Their cervix is soft. And they actually then started doing implantation around here. So this is where they did implantation. And this is because their temperature dipped really, really low right before ovulation. And then it went up. So you're looking for this deep drop. And that drop there is actually where the luteinizing hormone then shoots up really quickly. Because remember, we want to get that sperm in before the luteinizing hormone extracts the egg, right? So the basal body temperature is actually a really good indicator and often a good one, but it is also very hard. So you have to remember that the basal body temperature is actually the moment before you take off the sheets off your bed, before you get out of your bed, before you drink water, before you do absolutely anything, you have that basal body temperature in your mouth and you're charting that down before you even move. And it was actually really hard for me because I actually forgot a lot. So if you're not someone who is really, really on point with like remembering those kinds of things, making it maybe a routine when you're not cycle monitoring, even just taking your temperature as soon as you wake up, like you open your eyes, you reach over, you put the basal body temperature in your mouth, take your temperature, write it down, and then you go about your day. That's probably the only way it's going to work. It's a very sensitive temperature that can fluctuate very quickly. So you have to be very on purpose with that. So then of course here they show you the ferning. There's also really great apps that I'm sure people use and you already know about, so I won't go into that. Ovulation predictor kits, and then the cervical mucus. So after your period, sorry, I can't really see this because it's too small for me, but these are the different things that you're looking for. So again, like right before and during ovulation, it's thick and stringy, right? Usually after your period, you don't really have very much. And when before ovulation is close, it's getting a little more, it's a little bit more. And then at ovulation, that's when it's really, really stringy. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. All right. Okay, so final notes. Remember, no one is the same. You can change your situation for sure. So a lot of people have said to me like, oh, my doctor said that I can't have kids because I'm 40, or I have endometriosis, or I have PCOS. Everyone's situation is different. And also you have a lot of power in things that you do, whether it's through getting a naturopath, medication, lifestyle changes, thinking about what kinds of things you can do to support your egg quality, support your body in general. Remember, as I said earlier, your reproductive system is actually the last thing that your body actually takes care of. And so you have to think about how you're going to support your body as a whole in order to support your reproductive system. And so if endometriosis is a thing that you're dealing with, that is something to talk, of course, to your doctor about what your options are. And same thing with PCOS. PCOS is like an overarching systemic thing that is happening that creates the conditions that your ovaries are going through. And so thinking about what are some things that you have in order to support your body in making this happen. Another last thing that I want to point out is, there's a lot of talk often, I think because of how misogyny and patriarchy also really influence and impact the fertility world, and also impact, how we just understand babies being made. A lot of and because of like a lot of like the misogyny around people blaming like the egg and the like the egg like being the issue, and the egg quality, or your egg quality wasn't good, or you didn't have enough eggs, or you didn't do this enough for your uterus health, or things like that. I think it's really important to also remember that sperm is just as important and still plays a huge role in fertility. So if you're also dealing with like a lot of infertility issues and people talking about your infertility, it's also really important to think about the sperm quality that you have, and the quality of sperm that is possible and how you have access to, because that directly impacts your ability to also get pregnant. It takes all of that together. And remember, that moment of conception is very, very hard. And that's only one moment. The embryo entering and lodging itself into the endometrium lining is one part of a very long 40-week journey to get to an actual live birth, right? So there's a lot of things that are at play here. It's not just an egg problem or a fertility problem. This is like a very much a holistic, bigger way to look at it, if that's helpful. So yeah, and we can talk about that if you have any questions later for sure. But yeah, so just an overview of this, again, just so we can make sure that we all understand. So your body produces hormones which control your menstrual cycle. At the start of the cycle, which is the very start up here, one important hormone is the follicle stimulating hormone, which is FSH. That rises really high in the follicles in your ovaries, which is to develop and start producing another one called estrogen, which also gets higher, closer to there. Okay. And then the level of estrogen in your body is still increasing, and at a certain level, it causes a rapid increase, which is the LH, which again is that pink one. So this goes really, really high. Everything gets really high, including the estrogen. And the LH surge triggers ovulation, where the egg is released from the ovary. Your ovulation can depend on where you are in your cycle and how long your cycles are. So remember, some people say 14 days. It doesn't have to be 14 days. It could be longer, it could be shorter. We want to have like we want to have at least 14 days though, so that the follicle can actually grow, right? If we have a shorter follicular cycle, then that is actually also can be an issue. And you want to think about how you can extend that or what's possible there. Because then you don't have you don't have an opportunity for the follicles to get bigger, which is what we want. Once the egg has been released and it moves along the fallopian tubes towards the womb or the uterus, and the egg lives for up to 12 to 14 hours because sperm can live for several days. You are probably most fertile, you're most fertile and likely to get pregnant if you are able to inseminate or have sex on the day that you ovulate or the day before. So day before, usually, I remember I said people often do inseminations if you're doing a DIY at home, or if you're doing it at a IUI, they will probably opt to do it that sweet spot in between before you've ovulated officially and the day of ovulation. And it's very hard to find that moment. So it is very important, again, to track it. And that's why we're doing this work. As soon as you have ovulated, the collapsed follicle then starts producing what we call progesterone. See, the progesterone goes really high and everything gets lower again. Okay, so after ovulation, depending where we're at here, once the egg has released and it moves towards the fallopian tubes, towards the uterus, and it creates the progesterone, as we talked about. And as the empty follicle shrinks, if the fertilized egg and the embryo has not implanted itself into the uterus or the intrauterine lining, your level of progesterone actually decreases. So let's say it doesn't, there's not a successful pregnancy and it does not attach to the lining, it will then become, we're going here, then the progesterone actually dips really quickly. And then without that, sorry, let me just look over this. And then it will actually just prepare itself for the breakdown of the endometrium lining, which is your menstrual cycle. Or if you get pregnant, or if it is successful and then the embryo does create and attach itself to the wall, then the empty follicle is maintained, which creates the what we talked about, HCG, which is that hormone that we were talking about that actually starts going up right here. So that's an additional one that starts increasing. The progesterone keeps going and estrogen keeps going, because we actually need estrogen and progesterone to keep it going so that we can mature it enough to continue developing the embryo. Okay, and then so lastly, things to consider and some advocacy for yourself. Because as LGBTQ people, we have to consistently think about advocacy and things to consider for ourselves and what is unique to our situations, because we are not in the same situation as folks who are able to potentially like have sex and get pregnant, or have access to sperm or eggs or uterus in the ways that whenever they want for pregnancy. We put a little bit more thought and process into this. So you want to consider how you want to engage in the medical system or not. So as we talked about today, there is the home insemination, there is home cycle tracking, DIY cycle tracking, and then there's also the potential for going to a fertility clinic for either an IUI or an IVF. That's something to consider about how you want to engage with them or not. And that is completely up to you. It's also important to take your time. A lot of folks, especially I know folks who are older, who are like, you know what, I really need to do this like right now. I totally get that. It is also really important to think about how you're going to give yourself an opportunity to actually map this out. When it comes to fertility mapping and charting, as I said, you should probably give yourself at least 2 to 3 months or 2 to 3 cycles to really determine what is happening for you. Because if you're doing it for one cycle and you don't really know where you are in your ovulation cycle and you're spending money on sperm, you're spending money on all these other things, it might actually not be fruitful for you to actually just do it in one cycle. So taking your time is really important, even if you give yourself a few months. Also to, as I said, take the supplements and other things to help support your system. Everyone's situation is different. So, I think it's really important not to compare yourself to other people's either cycles or to compare yourself to other situations. Everyone is dealing with their own stuff. It's important to also build a support system, especially around fertility and potential infertility, if that's something that you're considering or maybe thinking about might be an issue. It is really important to build a support system that will be able to get you through this. If you are, for myself, I'm an autonomous parent. I'm a single parent by choice. And so that meant going to, you know, all the clinics appointments by myself, injecting myself with the medication for IVF. That was things that I had to do all by myself. And I had family and friends, of course, to help me. But at the end of the day, you know, thinking about how to build a support system, if you are partnered, it doesn't also have to be just you and your partners, right? Who is in your friend circle, your family circle that's going to support you? So those are some things to think about as well. Doing your research. If you're considering going to a fertility clinic, talk to other folks who have done it. There are parenting groups if you're in Toronto or other places that you're in, talking to them about like who are the fertility clinics that supported people the best, who is 2S LGBTQ specific or supportive. Those are some things that are important for research. Also looking into your own cycles, speaking to specialists. Also challenging and advocating if you can and if you need to. And also thinking about the next person that comes in. You know, when I was in the fertility clinics and they kept asking me about a father, for me, it was an advocacy piece about being very adamant about like, I'm a queer person. I'm doing this on my own. I'm a single parent by choice. You need to respect my family situation. And obviously it's, you know, I come with a lot of privilege in a lot of different ways. And so I think it is easier for me to do that than in other people. And taking that into consideration, especially for white folks who are in these spaces, thinking about your privilege of being able to advocate in different ways, and also considering the emotional impacts that has, considering, you know, you're also going through a really emotional time. Also remembering that fertility is really hard and it may take longer than you think. A lot of folks are like, oh, no problem. I know my cycles. My cycles are like 28 days, 14 day, I ovulate, done. That's amazing. That doesn't mean that it's going to happen immediately, right? So I think being really flexible and with what your expectations are, and also just kind of also understanding that this is a literal miracle that happens. I still don't understand how, you know, this meets this and then that becomes that and then it happens and we just like walk around and are human beings in the world. And so thinking about how, you know, special this process is and how emotional this process can be is very important. And centering your needs, centering what you need as a person in your cycle, and then also honoring your feelings in that. Your feelings are valid. These experiences are really hard and it is going to take a lot out of you. And so thinking about the emotional and psychological impact that has on yourself, on your community, on your family is really important. And so in addition to that, let's talk about it. Does anyone have any questions or have any concerns or any things that they wanted to touch on particular?